The Earth humans do not care for nature and its fauna and flora and therefore does not care about the creation and all its existence Sunday. May 7th, 1950 / checked for correctness. Sfath Meier, Niederflachs 1253, Bülach.
In the future, many malicious and exploitative things will happen on Earth to the Earth's resources and forests, as well as negative and destructive things to the planet, through the building up of land, floodplains and meadows, mountain areas, etc., as well as irreparable damage and disaster, and also the extermination of fauna and flora, many thousands of genera and species. This will take place through countless machinations of the overflowing great mass of Earth humans. And everything will far exceed the destruction of nature, fauna and flora, as well as the waters, land, atmosphere, and all areas, etc., of the war that ended 5 years ago. This is because, with regard to the great overmass of humanity, through their machinations and indifference, everything on Earth will come to such an extent that one day technology, in the form of artificial intelligence, will even rule over Earth humans, and the beginning of the development for this will be in the next 3 decades. And only 40 years later, in the early years of the 3rd millennium, everything will be so developed in this respect that it will be impossible to counteract the state of the end of evil and the evil of what is to come. And in the future, this will be the result of the low intelligence and indifference of the majority of humanity, which will allow that part of the unfit rulers to rule and reign completely irresponsibly, who in their greed for power and irresponsibility, and in their inability to govern either in righteousness or with understanding and reason, will not know how to do the correct thing. On the contrary, he will do so by harassing human beings and playing nasty with them, fighting them, and curtailing their rights and freedom through illogical laws, rules and regulations, etc., and still in this 20th century, 35 years from now, in the mid-1980s, the first technical electronic developments for an artificial intelligence will secretly begin to determine the daily lives of human beings in such a way that their genius will become more and more stunted and surpassed by a lack of general knowledge. This artificial intelligence will have very catastrophic effects, because it will be so detrimental to the majority of Earth humans that it will take away their own thinking and make them hopelessly dependent. This will be tantamount to a technical electronic enslavement of faith, which, as with religious delusion, will inevitably lead to a pseudo-thinking that encompasses the whole world. The technical developments of the future will bring masses of new products and herald the beginning of a situation in which Earth humans will soon and very quickly become hopelessly dependent on the new technology. Even children, who will then unfortunately be encouraged by adults to adopt innovations of all kinds. This will be particularly the case with new things, especially the new means of communication that will inevitably come in the future, when these will function as small portable mobile phones in about 50 years' time. As a result, writing letters and messages and much general correspondence will also be replaced by electronic forms in the future. All means of transport will also become addictive and delusional in the future, along with the mind and reason and other pathogenic natural, medical and chemical drugs of all kinds, which will become so addictive that it will no longer be possible to do without them. This will also apply in particular to cars, which will be regarded as prestige objects in the future, but will emit a lot of toxic gases and cause lasting damage to the climate. As a result, however, the atmosphere will become heavily polluted and toxic to breathe, which will lead to countless human beings falling ill, often with various types of cancer and respiratory problems, etc., and the climate will also be polluted to the point of collapse. This will also be the case as a result of a sea of ever larger and ever more spacious passenger aircraft for masses of holiday travelers, as well as countless ever larger transport aircraft and countless huge cruise ships for large masses of pleasure travelers, as well as vast numbers of transport ships and ever larger road transporters, which will cause the atmosphere and the climate to collapse worldwide, in addition to many other sources. As a result of this, there will be raging storms and great firestorms that will claim many human lives and also bring enormous destruction, which will particularly affect the USA when an area of the rich is virtually destroyed. But it will also very soon become catastrophic when much of the rainforest in Brazil is cleared for land reclamation, but this new land will be depleted and useless after only 2 or 3 years. However, out of greed for money and power, rainforest and normal forests in Brazil, as in various other countries on Earth, are also being plundered for their expensive timber, thereby contributing greatly to the inevitable climate change. Due to the large amounts of deforestation and the thinning of trees, oxygen production is gradually decreasing noticeably, thereby damaging the atmosphere and the global climate. In addition, with all the toxic gases that are released by humanity and pollute the climate, it is inevitable that a climate collapse will occur, which will cause a great deal of damage worldwide, far beyond the next millennium and into the third millennium. And the toxins spread by humanity will not only affect the atmosphere and the climate, but also the oceans and all waters in the land areas, as well as the entire flora worldwide, which will absorb any kind of toxin spread, mainly by industry, agriculture and horticulture, in order to achieve higher yielding crops. After the second decade of the next millennium, the rapidly growing Earth human population will begin to struggle to find enough land for natural food cultivation, because the mania and demand for new housing, motorways, sports grounds and other buildings of all kinds will increase in the new millennium as a result of the uncontrolled, irresponsibly immense increase in the human Earth population. This will also be followed by the irresponsible impact on wildlife and the complete extinction of species and genera of animals, creatures and other living beings by human beings, which will also affect countless genera and species of plants. In 20 years' time, human beings will have brought almost all whale species in all oceans to the brink of extinction. This will then lead to the emission of CO2 or carbon gas, which will be emitted by masses of cars, lorries, motorbikes, ships, aeroplanes, and all kinds of working machines and heating systems, which will be produced in ever-increasing quantities by human beings in the form of petroleum, which will be extracted from the earth. The petroleum will be converted by certain processes into petrol and diesel oil, etc., and consequently used to power combustion engines, which will then produce CO2 gases through the following combustion process, which will have a poisonous and pregnant effect on the atmosphere, affecting the climate, which will no longer be able to cope with the whole thing in the long term, leading to a climate upheaval that has long been in the offing, but which will have very bad consequences in the future. Large fires will destroy the forests in many countries around the world. The poles and glaciers will melt. Large parts of mountains will collapse and bury houses, human beings, villages, and other human achievements, causing much suffering, hardship, and misery. These will inevitably be the consequences of humanity multiplying by the billions to the extent of unreasonableness. which has already been the case for many years and will continue well into the next millennium. As a result, the whole of nature will be harassed, and many genera and species of fauna and flora will be wiped out. But this is already having a long-lasting effect, for it began early on through the fault of Earth humans, because neither understanding nor reason have always prevailed among them, but only selfishness, the desire for wealth and might, a confused belief in higher powers and their help, and consequently only insane delusion has ever prevailed. Now, CO2 gas can no longer be absorbed and stored in large quantities in the sea by the huge life forms of the oceans, also because they are being almost completely irresponsibly wiped out by Earth humans. This, just as these giants of the seas, the blue whales and other whale species, as well as the entire fauna and flora of the seas, waters, forests, and all land and air are being poisoned and killed by the machinations of Earth humans. In the future, they will all be affected and killed by many different and enormous quantities of toxins from human production, such as the main poisonous gas CO2, which they absorb and store. And with regard to the fact that many genera and species of fauna and flora will also be wiped out by Earth humans in the near future, as has been the case for decades and even centuries, it will take at least another 25 years or so, after which it will finally be slowly recognized that the hunt for the creatures of the seas and other waters is to be abandoned. Unfortunately, this will not be the case with regard to the wildlife of the land and the fauna and flora in general, because at the beginning of the next millennium, more than 50,000 species of fauna and flora will be wiped out every year, completely carelessly, unscrupulously and irresponsibly through the fault of Earth humans. The irrationality of the human population will harass the whole of nature and destroy and eradicate a great deal in and of nature. Many genera and species of wildlife will simply be killed off and even almost wiped out because their natural habitat will be ruthlessly claimed by human beings as a place to live. But what will result from the fact that they will be hunted and killed by Earth humans and driven to the brink of extinction will only become apparent in the next millennium, and only when the wild life forms, as well as other life forms of the seas, the waters, the land and the mountains, and also the air, the forests, and especially the rainforests, etc., begin to turn against Earth humans. And this happens when they first attack human beings individually, but then form groups and kill them. But the low intelligence, stupidity, and arrogance of the sheer mass of Earth humans will not understand for a long time why the wild animals and other life forms of the land, sea, water, and air attack human beings, injure them, or even kill them. For a long time, as a result of the arrogance, sufficiency, and arrogance of Earth humans towards nature and its fauna and flora, etc., which are the basis of all life's existence, it will not be understood that all life defends itself against every excess in its own wise way. Life forms of various genera and species decimate themselves when overpopulated. For example, certain animals by flocking together and plunging over rocks into an abyss to their death. This is how aquatic creatures, for example, large whales, bowhead whales, orcas, killer whales, etc., jump onto beaches or roll up to end their lives, either individually or as a herd. Other life forms end their lives or are otherwise decimated by overpopulation according to their genus or species, just as nature itself also intervenes in overpopulation, for example by spreading a fatal disease or rampantly spreading disease in parts of a genus or species and thus decimating them. The sea giants, especially the whales, will also form groups and act against human beings by attacking and even killing them. Even the other life forms, such as birds and insects of all genera and species, will in the future begin to defend themselves against the Earth humans who harass them and their ubiquitous and adverse machinations. Even if they do not attack human beings directly, they will, depending on their genus or species, come together to form huge swarms and, as a result of their sheer mass, will be able to change something in the life of nature that will enable them and many other living beings, such as animals, aquatic creatures and creatures, insects and carnivores, etc., to continue to live or make their lives better. Huge swarms of various genera and species of small and large birds, herds of mouflons, swarms of grasshoppers, ladybirds and masses of giraffe-necked courts, as well as masses of ants, swarms of fish, masses of courts and crabs, swarms of mosquitoes, masses of bacteria and fungi, etc., as well as packs of wild boars, swarms of butterflies, bees, wasps, hornets and hordes of spiders, herds of bison, masses of cockroaches, packs of wolves, rats and mice, will not only make themselves abnormally noticeable, but will also become a burden for human beings. But let us now explain what a swarm is, namely, a large, uniformly formed and three-dimensional mobile association of flying or water-dwelling genera and species, such as birds, fish and insects, etc., as well as crustaceans, etc. Masses are also formed by animals that form herds or flocks like other living creatures. It should also be said that animals, creatures and sometimes other living beings, such as sea creatures and other aquatic creatures, are sentient beings that feel fear, joy and affection, and that are also perceptible to very attentive human beings, and that many animals also display other emotions. All animals and various creatures, as well as the various higher life forms of the seas and waters, are capable of emotions and grief. For example, when a member or conspecific dies or is killed, just like human beings when they lose a loved one. Contrary to all the erroneous claims and the absolute ignorance of earthly animal scientists, all genera and species of animals, as well as various creatures, and many of the remaining life forms of the entire fauna and flora, have more or less sentient and also reactive abilities, etc., etc. Animals are consistently genera, or life forms. Animals are all genera or species of mammals which, depending on their genus and species, should not simply be labeled as animals, but named according to their genus or species. It is fundamentally wrong to simply call all life forms animals, because various genera and species of all living things are different from animals. Only sucker life forms are animals, because they give birth to their offspring in a living wise. So let us be clear once again, only animals are suckers or mammals, that is to say living and thus reproducing animals that produce breast milk and suckle their offspring. They therefore give birth to their offspring directly alive and do not lay eggs from which the offspring had to hatch alive after a certain incubation period. As is the case with fish and birds, etc., as a rule, mammals feed their offspring with their mother's milk. The animals or suckling animals best known to human beings are probably dogs and cats, as well as rabbits, hamsters, ibexes, barbets, horses and cattle, hedgehogs, cows, deer and stags, tigers and leopards, squirrels, lynxes, hyenas, whales, chimpanzees, gorillas, dolphins, orangutans, and of course, human beings. All life forms, lower and higher, of the land, sea, air and water, are thus to be named specifically according to their genus and species. They are capable of more than what human beings arrogantly claim for themselves alone, namely feelings and emotions as well as sensations, like all higher life forms in general, which in fact also possess an acute and affective life, depending on the genus or species. The genus is the natural foundation, or the basic class of the basic life form, that is to say, the genus. From the genus, or the basic life form, a further but altered and mutated life form can emerge through a natural or artificial mutation, which has certain similarities to the basic life form, but fundamentally has its own, and therefore different appearance, as well as other behaviors and a different vocal manifestation, etc. Such a life form is then a species. Such a life form is then an ausartom that has emerged from the genus or the basic life form, which is called a species for short, and is labeled according to its overall habitus. Fundamentally, not every life form may simply be called an animal, because if it is a snake, for example, then it is a snake of the genus reptile, and must be labeled according to its habitus, for example, viper, cobra, viper, or otter, so that it can be understood what it is. This alone is correct and effective. Thus an animal is an animal, a turtle, a fish, and a bird, but never an animal, for such an animal is and remains a living sucker, while other living beings of their genus or species are, for example, brooders or egg layers. However, all higher organisms of each genus and species have an active life or affect life according to their class, but differently according to their habitus. At the top of the list is the conscious awareness of human beings, which enables them to react consciously in any form and also to evolve. While certain higher animals have a so-called semi-conscious awareness, creatures and other higher life forms have an instinct affect life, and lower life forms only have an impulse affect life, and others only have impulse reactions, or a sensation response, or impulse stimulus reaction. So all this is not the same as with human beings, who have a conscious awareness. So in this respect, everything is different from animals, creatures, and all other life forms. Animals are and remain suckers, or so-called viviparous life forms. But creatures are not, because they are breeders, egg layers, or oviparous life forms, which incubate their eggs themselves and endeavor to raise the creatures that hatch from them, or not. This is in contrast to other life forms that also lay eggs, such as insects, but which allow their clutches of eggs to be incubated by the warmth of the earth, the weather, or the sun, etc., and do not care about their development, or do. Most insects lay eggs in the soil, inside wood or under leaves, also in plant stems under water, or insects even use other life forms, such as animals and human beings, to deposit the eggs under their skin from which larvae hatch, whereby the larvae look completely different from the adult insects of the same species. The development from egg to fully formed adult insect takes place in several stages. The development from egg to adult insect, therefore, takes place in several stages, whereby, as explained, larvae hatch from the eggs and become insects in the course of development. These then go through several molting phases before pupating into a chrysalis and finally becoming an adult insect. In total, there are countless genera and species of life forms, all of which are impossible to list because they exist in millions of genera and species, so only the main ones will be mentioned, such as 1. Vertebrate genera and their species, then 2. The genera and species of invertebrates, such as 3. The genera and species of plants, as well as 4. The genera and species of fungi, and 5. The genera and species of lichens. It should be noted that these various genera and species are found in forests, meadows, moors and swamps, on fields, mountains, on ice, in the air and on or in the land, as well as in the soil and in caves, etc. This, as well as in the seas and in various bodies of water on the planet. These life forms are mainly genera and species of mammals and creatures, as well as amphibians, insects, fish, birds, reptiles, lizards, mollusks, butterflies, moths, beetles, worms, dragonflies, grasshoppers, wasps, bees, hornets, plants, trees and reeds, etc. The most well-known life form on Earth is the human being, but it is not descended from a genus or species of ape, as Charles Darwin lugubriously and fraudulently claimed in the form of bone falsifications. Animals, creatures, and other life forms of many different kinds are the gardeners, caretakers and maintainers of forests, meadows, floodplains, fields and meadows, mountains, moors and swamps, etc., and through their daily behavior help to keep them healthy and make all life possible in the first place. Their role in these important ecosystems affects the air and climate in which human beings live for thousands of kilometers. For their own health and survival, human beings need all areas of nature, the seas and waters with their fauna and flora, and thus all life forms in general. Therefore, it is man's duty to preserve and save wild animals, as well as all aquatic life forms, instead of hunting and exterminating them. So hunting is to be banned, as is the shooting of airborne life forms, but the plundering of marine and aquatic life forms is also to be banned. This, as well as the dumping of rubbish, toxic waste such as rubbish, plastic, poisons of all kinds and etc., is to be banned because it affects all life of fauna and flora, and thus also that of human beings, and even endangers it immensely. The following is a brief explanation of all the fauna and flora found in Europe, based on what I learned from Sfath, what and how all these life forms are, etc. Amphibians, the fact that the frog spawn, the frog eggs, undergoes a metamorphosis and turns into newt's note, tadpole with little legs, and then into frogs or crots is something that every human being who is even halfway educated knows from an early age. The spawn is deposited into the water by the mother frogs or mother crots, after which the tadpoles hatch from the eggs contained in the spawn after a certain period of time. These then develop, and only after some time undergo metamorphosis to become newt's note, tadpoles with legs, which, depending on the species, undergo further metamorphosis to become frogs or crots. In order for the tadpoles to live at all, they breathe with the help of their gills, after which, however, when they undergo the metamorphosis into frogs or crots, depending on the species, they develop lung respiration, but are additionally supported by skin respiration. The frogs and crots exist in various genera and species, whereby these amphibians occur in many genera and species, as well as in groups, and are harmless croakers in Europe, except for the poison frogs in the Brazilian jungle, which are called poison dart frogs, etc. Bees. There are a few special things to explain here. Wild bees are of various genera and species, but they have nothing to do with honeybees, which are actually known to human beings, at least from the horary tale. However, there are many more bee species in Europe, such as wild bees, which are represented in Europe by more than 500 genera and species. A few of the genera and species of wild bees are organized as neatly or similarly as honeybees, while the majority of all genera and species of wild bees live individually and are therefore solitary. All female wild bees have a sting that is poisonous but harmless to human beings, so there is no need to be afraid of it. Furthermore, this should be explained. Wild bees are peaceful creatures and are not aggressive, but when a female wild bee stings, it is most likely because the bee is being tormented or is in distress. Honeybees, only female honeybees, that is to say queens and workers, have a stinger which is barbed. Male honeybees are called drones and therefore have no stinger. The stinger of the female honeybee is a modified laying stinger and is used exclusively for the defense of the colony. The term laying stinger refers to the organ that was originally important and used for laying eggs, whereby this has changed in the course of evolution in female honeybees, namely in such a way that the laying stinger has developed into a defense stinger that is now only used for defense. The original function of the ovipositor stinger in bees or their ancestors was an organ used to lay eggs in plants or other hosts. In honeybees, however, this laying stinger has been transformed through evolutionary change, so that honeybee workers now use it as a stinger, which is connected to a venom bladder for defense and thus also inject bee venom. The stinger is a pure and important weapon of defense for the bees and serves exclusively to protect themselves from potential enemies and to injure attackers. However, this is only reserved for female bees, that is to say queen bees and worker bees, which alone possess a stinger that also injects venom, but was originally and naturally developed for laying eggs. So the stinger of female bees has evolved into a defense stinger and has become an important weapon of defense for female bees. Plant wasps use the stinger to sting plants and lay eggs. In the case of ichneumon wasps, it is used to lay their eggs in insects, etc. The ichneumon wasp is a hymenopteron and has a parasitoid lifestyle, which means that the larvae of the ichneumon wasps grow inside or on the outside of insects. These hosts are often pests which are then killed. Therefore, ichneumon wasps are actually important beneficial insects in terms of biological pest control. The sting of bees was originally used according to its very different forms, in particular as a laying apparatus, laying drill, laying sting, laying tube. It was used functionally by female bees to lay eggs in various substrates. When a bee stings, it dies because, depending on the thickness of the human being's skin, the bee cannot pull out its stinger when it stings him, so it is injured and dies. It is also important to know that honeybees do not sting intentionally, but only instinctively when they feel threatened. The human being is stung by a bee, and if he does not remove the sting quickly, the venom bladder pumps the venom into the sting wound, causing the pain to occur and become more intense, which also makes it last longer. The human being is susceptible to bee stings, which triggers an allergic reaction. Honeybees use their stinger to defend their nest against intruders. There are so many genera and species of fish worldwide that they cannot be listed. Fish also colonize streams, rivers, lakes and seas, in addition to almost all standing water, and there are a whole range of genera and species that accompany other fish as pilots, or protect them, keep them free of parasites, or protect them from predators, such as fish that skin corals, etc. Certain marine fish, such as whales, traveled more or less long migrations to mate in certain places, while freshwater fish also seek out certain areas as spawning grounds, where they can migrate and lay their eggs or spawn in order to reproduce. However, this is only possible today if there are no impassable weirs, such as barrages blocking their way. Spawning grounds can be natural areas such as rivers, lakes and seas, but also artificial spawning aids such as spawning grids or pike nests. About 75 genera and species of grasshoppers are native to Europe. Depending on the genus or species, they are equipped with long or short antennae, and mostly with double-paired chitinous calotte wings, which in turn are built up with vein structures. They consist of two fan-shaped pairs of wings. The front wings, which are often folded and hard, protect the soft hind wings. The hind wings are spread out in flight and enable various locusts to fly correctly and well, although this is species-specific. The grasshoppers are divided into short-footed grasshoppers and long-footed grasshoppers, whereby some are in stages to other forms, the development of which will take thousands of years, whereby their wings have already largely regressed in the course of the past 300,000 years. Like various caterpillars, locusts also have powerful teeth and can bite powerfully with their chewing and biting jaws, which is as characteristic as the species' typical sounds or voice, etc. The long-footed grasshoppers rub their hard chitinous wings together to produce a sound or song, whereas the short-footed grasshoppers do this by rubbing their legs along the wings. Beetles are the most species-rich group in their field, so it is impossible to describe their diversity. It is estimated that there are well over 6,000 different genera and species of beetle living in Europe. Among the various genera and species is the cockchafer, which currently causes a lot of damage and annoyance, especially through its grubs. The marienkäfer is also very well known, while other käfer species are less known to human beings or not known at all, or only to coleopterists due to their hidden way of life. Some human beings may also be aware of the alpine longhorn beetle, the stag beetle, the colourful cherry tree beetle, or the rose beetle, as well as the fact that they live in the wood of trees during one phase of their lives. However, the fact that predatory ground oats also exist is unknown to many people, as is the fact that the green-striped ground oat and the lesser chrysalis, the golden ground oat and the marsh oat exist. Anyone who does not know that various ceruleans can bite powerfully should get to know the large mouthparts of a dune sandpiper. Dragonflies Europe is home to 80 dragonfly genera and species, which can also be divided into two orders, damselflies and damselflies. As larvae, dragonflies live in fresh water. As adults, they are very remarkable flying artists. As dragonflies, which live for about 3 months, They feed on all kinds of insects, mosquitoes, other dragonflies and flies as larvae and adults alike. Their large compound eyes, which enable them to see almost all round, are particularly striking. Plants. Every human being knows a few plants or little plants, but their diversity is so great that it is impossible for a human being to know all of them, but only a few, as the number of genera and species is effectively in the millions. Only very few human beings are aware of a certain diversity of the plant world, except botanists, who ultimately deal with it professionally, but even they have limits because it is also impossible for them to know the entire immeasurable diversity of plants that exists on planet Earth. There are several thousand different genera and species in Europe, but there are so many worldwide that they cannot be counted, nor can their existence be found and explored in all parts of the Earth, mainly in its primeval forests, seas, and interior. What is known ranges from the tiniest plant. Through the teachings of Sfath, I am only familiar with a tiny water vane note, dwarf duckweed, as he called the tiny growth, to the largest and most gigantic sequoia. Botanists are well aware of the most common plants. From small to large, of all known beautifully flowering meadow flowers, of mosses, grasses, shrubs and trees, but everything is only a part of what in truth exists as a whole. Reptiles are snakes of all genera and species, as well as lizards, sand lizards, wall lizards, green lizards, crocodiles, caimans, alligators, gavials, iguanas, geckos, chameleons and skinks, as well as monitor lizards, etc., and a species of turtle that belongs to the reptile group. Snakes can be divided into their many genera and species, as well as poisonous vipers and adders, and also non-poisonous vipers. What all reptiles have in common is that they practically jump out of their skin when they grow. Butterflies and their diversity are truly impressive, and the impression is further enhanced by their close observation, which shows that in nature in Europe there are 4 different forms of butterflies in particular, starting with the inconspicuous egg, then strikingly with the caterpillar, and also with the chrysalis, and fourthly with the butterfly itself, which moves through the air as a scaled and often extremely colourful fluttering creature. Many butterflies are of enormous importance as pollinators of flowering plants. They are completely defenseless creatures which, it seems, are able to evade and escape their predators by means of warning colours and poisonous deposits, as well as exchange manoeuvres. Mammals, which, as we know, also include human beings, are creatures that give birth to their offspring alive and feed their offspring with their mother's milk. This is why they are also referred to as mammalia, which refers to the fact that all female mammals have a mammary gland. The suckling of the young by the mother has another very practical advantage, namely that the parents can keep their offspring under supervision and in their care for longer. Birds exist as songbirds, birds of prey, waders, waterfowl, which are estimated to number between 9,000 and 10,000 bird species worldwide, while Europe is estimated to have around 300 to 350. Europe is also very important for migratory birds, which stop off in many places on their way south. And in winter, many bird guests from the far north remain in the European countries and their lakes, such as Lake Constance. These birds of various genera and species lay their eggs during their stay, which they then also hatch and produce offspring. This is also the time when the birds molt or change their plumage, which is a particularly sensitive and dangerous phase of their lives. This is particularly the case because human beings are often ruthless in their exploitation of the environment, to which many bird species react extremely sensitively in the event of disturbance. Birds are bioindicators, living beings, like many other organisms, which react to environmental influences, and in this wise are an early warning system for the quality of the environment. In their own natural wise, they reveal changes in the environment, such as pollution and changes in the environment, and thus the ecosystem. Bioindicators can also be other and very different types of organisms, such as the entire fauna and flora, or the extremely diverse microorganisms. However, birds are known to be very good bioindicators for the environmental compatibility of planning projects. Mollusks are snails, mussels, and cephalopods, squid octopus, which at first glance appear to be very different creatures, comprising a wide variety of genera and species. Genera and species from this group colonize the seas, as well as freshwater lakes, streams and rivers, such as the lesser river mussel, which also lives on land, and in fresh waters, these creatures filter food from the water. But in the near future, and it will be 10 to 12 years from now, freshwater mussels in particular will run the risk of extinction or at least a significant decline in their populations due to severe water pollution. This is already very regrettable, as it will permanently disrupt the ecological balance in streams, rivers, and lakes in a manner that the importance of these creatures in nature will be lost to the greatest possible extent. This must also be said and explained that everything is not simply the same species, but fundamentally different, as in the case of the human being, who belongs to the same species, but is divided into different races that differ according to skin color. This visible separation, however, is inherent in all animals, creatures and higher life forms of the seas, waters and air, partly instinctive, impulsive or instinctive and outside of conscious thought and clear understanding and bare reason, as these are or should be inherent in human beings. However, this is effectively doubtful, and it is true that understanding and reason are not inherent in the majority of Earth humans, for their senses and desires are orientated towards war, self-deception, revenge, hatred, lies and deceit, as well as selfishness, vice and retaliation, etc. This, as well as degenerate behavior, is the result of a lack of understanding and reason. This, as well as also degenerate sexual lust fulfillment, from which a she-mass of the Earth's population unreasonably emerges, and through their thoughtless and criminal wars and other evil machinations a great deal of life in nature and its fauna and flora will be wiped out, destroyed or annihilated. The attitude of human beings will increasingly give way to depravity in the future, just as the education of human beings will degenerate, and only a certain minority with understanding and reason will be able to save what can still be saved. And it will be even worse and worse when, in the next millennium, the emerging artificial intelligence will blind human beings. Every shaping of true thinking and feeling, as well as the good state that every human being can create as a high life form, will be disregarded and trampled underfoot in the future, well into the third millennium. The truth is also that the conscious awareness of human beings, as well as the entire body that belongs to it, is largely responsible for the formation of emotions and feelings, etc. The human being is also responsible for the formation of the body. Just as the human being is also capable of the emotions of joy and sorrow, as well as grief. which is not only peculiar to human beings, but also to every other life form capable of grief, and expresses itself in him as emotion. He should build this up more strongly and more strongly within himself in the future. For this will be urgently necessary, for otherwise, if he does not follow this, a wicked indifference and irresponsibility will fall upon him, so that he will rot in every respect and will be pushed around by the power-obsessed leaders of the impotent state as a will-less being with ever less freedom and rights, merely as a horrendous slave. However, it is also very important that other issues are addressed, namely nature and its fauna, which is to say the loss of insects, which will be caused in particular and mainly by the coming commercially orientated, industrial and intensive agriculture and horticulture. This is because these natural food-growing businesses will spread and release many hundreds of poisonous species into the wild in order to irresponsibly combat the insects and pests, etc. they do not want, and to greedily increase the yield and growth of their products. However, the entire food industry must also be mentioned in this context, which in future will use harmful chemicals to flavor its many products, the longer the more. It will also become common for food to be mixed with crickets processed into flour and liquids, as well as with flour from cereal mulled oats and flour from migratory locusts, flour oat larvae, and also from mealworms and various creepy crawlies, etc. These flours and liquids will be processed in a variety of ways. These flours and liquids are then processed into many foods, such as chocolate, bread, biscuits, other baked goods, cheeses, jams, spreads and pasta, etc. Of course, these ingredients are labeled on the packaging, but only with numbers, etc., so that the human beings who read them do not know what the ingredients really are. And in this respect, at the beginning of the third millennium at the latest, such insect meal, as it will simply be called, will be mixed into many foods, whereby many consumers will not know what they are eating in foods that are adulterated with insect meal. So this is inevitably coming at the beginning of the third millennium. Just as many other things will also be done to food unknowingly to consumers, so consumers will know nothing and also understand nothing even if they read and study all the contents labels. But all of this is only one thing, because it will also be particularly bad when the descendants of those who lived in the Nazi Empire will be at the helm of state leadership in the coming new millennium and will continue to orientate the attitudes of their ancestors, their parents, and grandparents, as was the case during the last World War. And their attitude will be that of war, murder, torture, and destruction, so that they will also be Nazis in the coming third millennium, without them being able to recognize this themselves in their powerlessness and low intelligence and conjuring up evil. As Sfath and I have seen, their illogical, illusory thinking, decisions, actions, and behavior will bring nothing good in the future of the new millennium. If everything is considered, then there will be no peace, no freedom, and no security, but war, destruction, and devastation will shake the world, as will happen many times in the coming decades of this century. This will happen as far away as the Middle and Far East, very often through the fault of America. And in the coming Germany of the next millennium, the majority of the power-obsessed leaders of the state will be war-lusting from the very beginning of the first decades and will interfere in a war in Eastern Europe, provoking new calamities and even endangering the whole of Europe. The entire mindset of those who will think like Nazis in the future in the third millennium, like their ancestors before them in the Nazi Empire, at least from 1939 to 1945, will not want real peace and freedom, because in their mindset and in their behavior and aspirations there will be war and power grabbing, through which they will conjure up evil. And many state leaders and parts of the people will then be called Nazis because in their attitudes and opinions they will only cherish war instead of peace, and will lasciviously grant false justice to all those who will bring warlike and unpeaceful mischief into the world by supplying weapons and money. They will all be the power-hungry, war-minded and Nazi-minded people of those state leaderships and the people who will lie that a belligerent right for war-mongering self-defense is the right. And this will already be the case at the beginning and especially in the third millennium, when America will unleash an unjust war in eastern Arabia with enormous lies and also provoke a vicious and long-lasting war in Eastern Europe, in which many state leaders and lowly intelligent and simple-minded parts of the peoples of foreign states will take sides. And this will also be the case when, in around 75 years' time, a Hitler-like Nazi genius appears in Israel, which was founded 2 years ago, and war is waged against the Arab states and mass murder in the sense of genocide is carried out. This will be the same as ever, because the Nazi-like Israeli war leader will be able to carry out his war-murdering work scot-free, without being punished for it, because, on the contrary, he will still be granted the right to wage war. This will lead to Arabia opposing the new Israel, and warlike attacks against Israel will emerge far to the south, which will also be hostile to Persia and trigger acts of war across other states. In the third decade of the next millennium, however, the leaders of the Third Reich, which ended 5 years ago, and of France will do everything in their power to ensure that renewed hatred arises and leads to enmity and all kinds of evil, and even to murder, manslaughter, and, in great fear, even to incitement to war, as will also be the case in Switzerland, where various leaders in Bern will then treacherously destroy the country's neutrality and make Switzerland an outlaw for war attacks, and also act contrary to the constitution of the state. In addition to all this, an already noticeable climatic upheaval will continue to be demanded, which will effectively take place and cannot be stopped. Urbanization and land sealing, as well as the high use of pesticides and other poisons of all kinds, mainly by agriculture and large-scale horticulture, as well as private individuals, will destroy the biodiversity of the insect world and other living creatures and wipe out much of it. The sheer low intelligence and stupidity of the state leaders will contribute a great deal to this, who, in their ignorance of nature and its fauna and flora, will allow countless poisons, toxic fertilizers, and poisonous repellents against insects and pests of all kinds to be spread in nature, and claim that a minimum of this and that poison is harmless to human beings. The human beings, animals, creatures, and many other life forms will fall ill, die, and ultimately die a miserable death. However, only a few human beings will effectively worry about this and also think deeply about how the evil can be stopped and what can be done against the death and extinction of a great deal in nature and its fauna and flora, especially with regard to the vital diversity of insects and wildlife forms. The industrial agriculture that will inevitably emerge quite soon in the future, as well as the commercial horticulture that will now emerge in the future, the reason for which will be the crazy endless growth of the human population, will not only make life difficult for many small and large animals in the meadows, fields, meadows and forests, and rob them of their habitat, but also that much life will be wiped out. Large-scale cultivation and the irresponsible use of fertilizers treated with various toxic chemicals contribute to insect mortality, whereby the bird populations of the various genera and species also decline drastically with the insect mortality, as does the biodiversity of the insect world due to the many poisons. Furthermore, in addition to the senseless and absurd, as well as hobby-like hunting, through which animals and many creatures, as well as birds and other life forms of all genera and species, are simply shot down in order to allegedly cherish and care for them with lies and deception. The truth is that in the forests and meadows, everything that comes before the barrel of a gun is simply shot down for the joy of killing and shooting. This also happens in the seas and waters through overfishing, whereby the higher and lower forms of aquatic life are wiped out, also for the sake of food, for the sheer and crazy overpopulation. In the future, this will lead to many forms of wildlife in water and on land being dynamized by the instinct of self-preservation to defend themselves against human beings, and to defend their habitats against Earth humans who threaten to exterminate them simply for the joy and pleasure of the dead, or for the sake of enrichment. In the future, this butchery of wild life forms is also linked to the rapid and unscrupulous robbing of their habitats. This is because in the future more and faster houses, factories and other buildings, sports grounds, roads, museums and other things will be built for the immensely growing humanity, and oil rigs, etc., will be set up in the seas for the plundering of petroleum and natural gas. This is precisely because the human population will increase very quickly and horrendously by rapidly and completely uncontrolled and senselessly producing and giving birth to masses of offspring worldwide, so that from today, when the Earth is still populated by around 2.5 billion human beings, the Earth human population will increase to around 10 billion in just 75 years, and the planet will be massively overpopulated. It is already irrevocably certain that this will rob and largely destroy the natural habitat of the entire wildlife world, which is important for life and its prosperity, including the land, air, meadows, fields, mountains, forests, oceans, and all land waters. This, in addition to the fact that in the future huge amounts of toxic waste will be disposed of in the seas and land waters, as well as on floodplains, fields, meadows, mountains, and forests, and hundreds of poisons of all kinds will be spread in the wild, mainly by agriculture and horticulture. However, neither the manufacturers of the hundreds of poisons, poisonous products, many toys contaminated with poison, nor the emerging plastics, Eternit and plastics of all kinds, etc., nor their users and consumers will be concerned that much of the natural life of fauna and flora will be poisoned and die miserably as a result. Many natural foods, as well as artificially produced foods, are also poisoned from the ground up, and many of them with pathogenic chemical additives, which are causing more and more types of cancer in human beings, which are often long-lasting and painful and usually end fatally. Forests, their trees, bushes and shrubs, and all the countless other plants of all genera and species are not the only life forms that absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and store these toxic gases. Whales and many other aquatic creatures also do so. But elsewhere, there are also all the wild life forms to which we owe the fact that life can exist on Earth at all. And in this respect, for example, sharks and other fish species, moray eels, rays and countless genera and species of marine life, etc., should be mentioned in the oceans. This as well as many other creatures in swamps and rivers, such as beavers, sea otters, frogs, water snakes, and crocodiles, etc., all of which, in addition to all land life forms worldwide, wild animals, creatures, and all the billions of other life forms and birds of the air, ensure that the Earth is habitable and can support and continue to support life. Indeed, they all ensure that the forests, trees, shrubs, and all plants of all genera and species on the land, in the seas and waters, and everywhere on Earth, grow, thrive, and support life, and thus also ensure the existence of human beings. If they were all absent, then no life would be possible on Earth, in all the seas and waters, because everything would be completely lifeless and dead, just like all the land masses, deserts, swamps and moors, the mountains and all the air. The ice is home to polar bears, penguins and Arctic foxes, etc., while on land there are genera and species of animals such as bison, baleen, wolves, wildebeests, zebras, kangaroos, deer, stags and elephants, as well as creatures and all the other millions of life forms. Depending on the genus or species, these diverse life forms eat and feed on a wide variety of plants or other life forms. As a result, they, like human beings, also excrete feces, thereby shaping the forests, meadows, fields, mountains, waters, seas, and all landscapes, and thus the plants through their excretions and their way of life. Big game, for example, roams through the forests and creates aisles and open spaces where small and large plants can grow. Elephants, for example, eat softwood from softwood trees, which grow quickly and remain low, while hardwood trees grow slowly and become large and powerful, as is the case in the rainforests. Through their food, depending on their genus and species, the wild animals and creatures, as well as the many other living creatures, maintain the existence of all living beings, such as insects, cheetahs, bees and wasps, snakes, crabs, crocodiles and frogs, worms, caterpillars, moths and butterflies, and also bacteria and viruses, mice, fungi, mites, rats, ants, worms and well over 100 billion genera and species, etc., etc., which will keep all gardens, soil, forests, meadows and pastures healthy, as well as also the population of wild animals and creatures, just as it is done in the seas and land waters, as well as by the birds of the air. Every genus and species of animal, creatures, or other living creatures, such as snakes, vipers, lizards, flies, mosquitoes, ants, frogs, caterpillars, crabs, birds, bees, hornets, wasps, moths, butterflies, and worms, etc., contribute to maintaining the biological balance. The human being, on the other hand, counteracts this, for example, through his hunting behavior, which he misunderstands as game regulation, and is of the false opinion that he thereby keeps the game population in order, in a wise and correct numerical measure for the mass of humanity. However, the fact that the number of wild animals and creatures, as well as all other life forms, is natural is completely disregarded, as a result of which creatures and wild animals, etc., are decimated, which even leads to the extinction of various genera and species of animals and creatures, etc. The fact that everything can be done in this way is due to the ever-growing mass of Earth humans, who are unscrupulously becoming more and more prevalent, and have turned the natural food-related hunting of wild animals and creatures into an Ausartung hobby, so that in the future large groups of hunting parties will make the forests unsafe for all wildlife and exterminate them. They will also hunt the fields, swamps, mountains and moors, etc., and all land waters and seas for animals and creatures, and will gradually exterminate them. This is what happened to the last Baron in Switzerland in the last century, when hunters shot it in 1898 in the Meier in Valkammer. The wolf was also completely wiped out in Switzerland, as was the lynx, although hunters have always been supposed to regulate and maintain good game populations. This is contrary to the fact that various wild animals, so-called predators, such as wolves, lynxes and foxes, naturally kill deer and stags, etc., in the wild for their food, and thus also maintain the health and diversity of forests, meadows, pastures, and all the meadows, whereby their plants, from the smallest to the giant tree, thrive and grow better. But this has long been forgotten by human beings. The importance of biodiversity has also been completely forgotten, just in terms of the so-called insect world. Railways will transport goods of all kinds from all over the world on a massive scale, and also tourists to such an extent that everything will be overflowing. In the same way, huge transport ships on the world's oceans and also on inland waterways, as well as huge aeroplanes, will pollute the atmosphere and the climate with toxic exhaust gases to such an ever-increasing extent that the climate will inevitably and irreversibly change, for which the first signs are already visible, to which the world war that ended 5 years ago has already contributed a great deal. This will bring about what could never happen in 5 billion years of the planet's existence due to its evolutionary change, namely that in just 75 years the Earth human population will grow by many billions to almost 10 billion, which will already be the case in the 3rd decade of the next millennium. But this irresponsible human growth will bring with it the fact that not only will the planet be so irresponsibly robbed of all its treasures, but also the fauna and flora will be harassed, in some cases completely wiped out, and largely all the foundations of life, for all life in general, will be driven to the brink of its existence. All this will be the fault of the sheer and insane mass of earthly humanity, which today, in 1950, still amounts to around 2.5 billion, but will grow to around 10 billion in just 75 years. Earth humans, in their low intelligence, religious delusions, addiction to wealth and indifference, mismanagement, irrationality, and irresponsibility, will in every wise ensure that many kinds of future disaster will be unavoidable. In this way, however, Earth humans will continue to be completely indifferent when all the evil that will begin in this century begins. This will be the case when, on a large scale, everything will be done in a criminal and also completely irresponsible wise to continue to harass and even destroy and exterminate the planet and its many species of fauna and flora through idiotic, selfish and dishonest machinations, such as the construction of many blocks of houses, roads, sports grounds, mountain constructions and airfields, etc., and to wipe out many tens of thousands of species absolutely irrevocably for all time. Since time immemorial, the majority of Earth humans have not cared one iota about nature, also not about its fauna and flora, nor about everything that concerns creation. Consequently, they do not realize their responsibility towards all earthly life and existence in any wise. The human being thinks only of himself and his own well-being, not of the life of fauna and flora, nor of the planet, nor of what makes life possible and nourishes it. Only an absolutely small minority is concerned about the existence of nature and its fauna and flora, which is creation as a whole, but not an imaginary god that Earth humans devised in ancient times, and that related to Earth foreigners, human beings, whom they considered to be superior. And that minority of human beings, the honest and sincere ones, not simply for the sake of filthy lucre, and only for the sake of destruction or for the sake of participation, etc., who will effectively take to the streets in the future, demonstrating for environmental protection, etc., against the sheer low intelligence of those in power, and the majority of Earth humans who are the same, will not be taken seriously and will even be fought against by those in power. Those, however, will then be excluded from righteousness who, out of selfishness and for the sake of money, which will flow from the insane rich to demonstrators, will idiotically and demonstratively stick to the streets, roar and romp around, as my friend Sfath and I have seen in the future, and they will thus achieve the opposite of what the demonstrations are actually intended to achieve. The unrighteous will only make a racket and really do nothing to protect all life, the planet, nature, and its fauna and flora, but they will do nothing good to protect nature and its fauna and flora through their negative behavior and actions. On the contrary, they will only cause damage and destruction, because in many cases, if at all, they will only be interested in profit and money as a reward, which they will receive for their wrong behavior from crazy, money-rich donors. This kind of unscrupulous demonstrators will be completely and utterly irresponsible, like the donors who finance everything for their own benefit or out of insane and deviant joy. This type of very easily influenced and misguided demonstrators will place themselves very importantly in the foreground and in the spotlight of the media, and will allow themselves to be stuck on the streets as very important demonstrators to cause public damage, for which they will then be well paid by rich beneficiaries. It is true that since time immemorial, and even more so in the times to come, only very few human beings have taken their responsibility towards all life on the planet, nature and its fauna and flora seriously, because only an absolute minority is self-thinking and educated enough to see and recognize the real truth, and to behave and act correctly and in accordance with what is right. The majority of Earth humans, however, is only ill-educated, behaves wrongly and acts contrary to what is natural and evolutionary, as it is also completely misregulated by laws laid down by the state. Namely, by demanding and requiring, at least in times of peace, valid for men of full age, which can even be extended to minors and women in times of war, as in Hitler's World War from 1939 to 1945, through low intelligence, and thus non-thinking, and also out of sheer fear on the part of the majority of all people, that a state conscription and thus armed military comes about and is compulsory. It is precisely because of this, and hardly anyone who is only addicted to his illusory thinking loses a righteous thought about this, that every human being who is drafted and conscripted into military service is compulsorily trained by the state to be a murderer and then forced to murder. if he is then ordered to murder, kill and destroy in a war, or otherwise be ordered to do so for any other reason. This is in contrast to the fact that correct thinking, behavior, non-killing and action are absolutely vital for the existence and preservation of the planet, and also for the smooth functioning of nature and its fauna and flora. Nature is truly the real creation, if it is seen as universal existence, and it alone embodies the actual, absolutely pure natural entity, but not an imaginary god of some misleading religion and sect, which must be delusionally and fervently, helpfully and slavishly worshipped, idolized and implored with false prayers. As a rule, human beings have unfortunately misunderstood prayer since time immemorial and misused it religiously as worship and adoration, begging for help and adoration, etc., to an imaginary god or to numerous gods. A prayer to creation is not a humble worship, nor an adoration or glorification, but effectively a tribute and honor that is expressed. Moreover, and this should be said, a sincere prayer to creation is, however, in all its word value and behavior, truly a mediative and respectful appreciation of thanking you, honoring and honoring all that exists, namely nature, which acts not only in the cosmos, but universe-wide as energy and power and as existence is really creation. Prayer has been used from time immemorial by human beings in the understanding of prayer meditatively and devoutly as thanks, honor and appreciation of nature and creation, as explained, in moments of thankful, honoring and appreciative devotion to the whole of nature or creation, which brought forth and allowed everything necessary for life to flourish through its energy and power, and ensures this for all time, without demanding anything in return, not even a prayer or the like. But when a human being performs one, it is out of gratitude, honor, and appreciation for the existence of all that exists, which human beings simply call creation. The respect, the basic attitude, sympathy, behavior and inner attitude of human beings towards nature or creation was completely natural and without belief in early times, but was based solely on truth, thankful for the tangible and detectable, visible and perceptible, and focused on the real. The human being's senses and aspirations were thus only formed in such a way that they could mentally, logically, and reasonably realize them. Unfortunately, however, this changed, as is unfortunately normal for human beings, when other human beings with fantasies and confused ideas turned against the natural and consequently seduced those who thought in terms of reality and who were logically truthful and turned them into believers in crazy fanatical fantasies and all the confused ideas and illusionary ideologies. This was because the fanatical fantasists and delusional idea mongers harassed the logical truth thinkers for so long and undermined their logic until they began to doubt reality and its truth and ultimately ignored it, and forgot it in order to become believers in the crazy and completely confused and indoctrinating fantasies and delusional ideas, and began to become addicted to them. And it came as it should according to the senses of the persuaders, namely that the majority of Earth humans bowed to the faith of the fantasists and delusionists, and fell hopelessly for them and their eyes of persuasion. The reason for this were foreigners who had come from afar, beings with sometimes very foreign appearances, with large eyes, long-skulled, giant, normal and short stature, as well as humanoids, and those with a more or less animalistic appearance. Because of their large and highly developed technology, which was futuristic for Earth humans who did not know such things, and because of their knowledge and skills, they were regarded, considered and glorified as superior beings, and ultimately misunderstood as gods and omnipotent beings who are said to be the builders of heaven and earth. This misconception led to a firm belief in them, and in this became a fantasy reality that suppressed all reality and its truth. As a result, deities and thus gods were slowly created through faith, into which the lies of persuasion were woven and accepted. In the course of time, this led to the emergence of fairy tales and fantasies of various forms of religions and their beliefs. And as a result of delusions, lies, deception and fantasy, etc., a linear religious concept of life was made out of the whole in a misleading way. Accordingly, it is believed, at least in Christianity and its sects, that human beings will be judged by God after their life and after their death. Namely, that they will go to heaven and be rewarded for their good deeds or burn in hell and be punished. Islam, on the other hand, teaches that there will be a final resurrection and the day of judgment. In all this nonsense, however, the truth is told that it is impossible for reincarnation, that is to say rebirth, which has been moronically accepted as a fact since time immemorial against all given truth, to have any prospect of reincarnation of human beings into a body or any being of a non-human life form. The fact that is correct, because the personality-less and neutral creation life energy always revives a new personality when a consciousness is revived, and thus absolutely excludes reincarnation, which has been fantasized by human beings in such a way that the same deceased human being should be reborn as such and live again. So in this wise, the earth humans, who had already fallen prey to faith, accepted these fantasized imaginary delusional beings as the imagined creators of nature, space and the universe, and as protectors and helpers of human beings on earth, whereby these gods naturally also had to be worshipped and adored, which all the strictly God-believing earthlings have to do to this day in accordance with their faith in an imaginary god or gods, because their worship has become compulsory for believers. Especially because the alleged God and these God beings, who are certainly imaginary in every case, have led worldwide to many fearful delusions of punishment for non-believing, non-human worship of God or gods, and non-belief in crazy religions and sects, whereby there are no limits to the fanatical and stultifying delusional belief of human beings. This is especially the case today with the prisoners of faith of those religions that have dedicated themselves to an imaginary deity, such as the religions and sects of Christianity and Islam, who live under the delusion that there is a God sacrificer in heaven who has created everything and anything, preserves it, and is therefore the creator of all things, as well as the good and holy guardian and custodian of human beings and of everything in general. This, while in the so-called holy the eternal fire blazes, in which the devil, after a wicked and wrongly led life and suffered death, will torment the faithful to God and roast for all eternity. But now the following should be explained. In German usage in particular, the term prayer has become so religiously devoted, embedded, ingrained and changed that instead of being cultivated as a form of meditative devotion of thanking you, honoring nature or all creation, and thus everything that exists and exists, it is now misused by human beings as a religiously imbued platitude. And this is because prayer has been transformed into a false and religiously sectarian disvalue, whereby an absolutely imaginary God has since then been understood and used in this way as a begging, fear-inducing and helper, etc. This is already being done in this way. This has been the case ever since the old High German word Gebet was misunderstood and inappropriately transformed into prayer. Unfortunately, in such a way that it is now fundamentally understood and used only in a religious and sectarian sense, not as a prayer of thank you, honor and appreciation of nature and thus of creation, but as a false and deviant plea for help and blessing, etc. In his original form, Emmanuel also taught, like all true children before him, that the being of creation, which was already understood and explained to human beings by all true children as existence of nature and existence of nature as well as all-encompassing existence, should be met with honor and respected in every wise and not be harmed in any way. This is because life is endangered and destroyed, and even destroyed and irrevocably wiped out in the long run by every act of harassment. However, religious and sectarian earth humans, who worship an imaginary religious god in particular and beg him for help, misunderstood the term Jubei even in ancient times, which originally had nothing whatsoever to do with a religious sectarian god and prayer, from which the meaning of supplication, begging, humility, adoration, and worship, as well as submissiveness and the like, emerges. In principle, the value of the word jibei was the opposite of give, namely in such a way that something should not be asked or begged for, but given, but rather the sense of a free meditative, thoughtful, verbal or non-verbal silent gift of thanks, honor and appreciation towards nature and everything creational was intended.